Okay. Hello, everyone. And hello at home, anyone watching me. Can you see me? How many is it? 3 people watching me. 3 people watching me through Facebook. And here there's about 20 people here, so that's much better. 3 on their own. So, anyway. So, thank you to Damien inviting me to come and helping me organise. And thanks for everyone else to come as well. Thanks for attending and watching my presentation. So, I've often presented about deaf people in prisons and in courts. I've done it maybe 15 or 20 times. But I often have a problem of waffling and talking excessively. So if you think I'm starting to get really boring, please please scrunch up some paper and throw it at me to try and brief the time that I'm speaking for. So who am I? So Damien has introduced me a little bit, but I'll just extend on that. So that's my name, Cormac Leonard. That's my sign name. And I found out, and there's actually a different person with the same sign name, and he's still alive, so I've robbed his sign name. So I had no idea, I've always put C and L together and thought that was okay, but there's already that sign name exists, so oopsie. So I am a hearing person, and my parents aren't deaf, they're hearing. So I live in Drogheda, and that's why that's the sign name of Drogheda? Because of Saint Oliver Plunkett, and he was decapitated in the church. That's why it was the Drogheda. Some people don't like and think it's a bad sign, but that's what the deaf people have Drogheda, so I got it from them. So I'm an interpreter for 12 years now. Interpreting in many different areas. So I'm still interpreting today, but also I'm a part-time student studying history. I'm studying to do a PhD. So I started in 2014 and will be for a 6-year period studying very hard for 6 years for another 3 now. Well, it's nearly unbearable, but so if you do studying to be a doctor, you have supervisors, that are experts in their field and advise you and help you through your studies. So I have 2 supervisors, so it's handy enough. And they are, I'm sure you know, John Bosco. He's deaf, so he's one of my supervisors. And my second is Patrick Gagan, who is a hearing man. So John Bosco is an expert in the deaf studies field, and he's and Patrick Gagan is an expert in history field. So together, I have a great team, and they're a really good guide for my studies. So this is what I'm studying, specifically deaf people in Irish institutions. Starting around 1816, all the way up until 1924. And after 1924, I leave that out completely and I just focus on that time period. And I just focus on a lot about how deaf people lived, and deaf people in institutions like in prisons, in the court systems, in the workhouses, in the mental hospitals, and boarding schools too, St. Joseph, St. Mary's and such. So I focus a lot on that. Yes, I have also found from newspapers, and they've also talked about deaf people working on farms. So yeah, I've gotten a lot of different sources of information, so maybe you'll see some sorts of information from that. I wouldn't be able for that farming work now. And that's not nearly strong enough. You'll be a lot better than me. So this is what I've sort of talked about already. So I've gathered many sources, a lot of information about how deaf live, and I've gotten that information from all these different sources. So one of the websites I've used, this is one of them, Find My Past. So many different sources of information, like offices and libraries, and many archives, and I've researched from books and taken bits of information from everywhere. So I have quite a large amount of information, nearly too much, don't know where to put it. But it's not really paper, it's all on my computer, so that's why all this memory's full now. So now I need a second computer, but sure. So my main interest, my most interesting is in the courts and in the law sector. So I really focus on what it's like for deaf people in courts. That's my main interest. And I'm interested in this because deaf people have gone into courts because of being a witness to a crime, and they would also, they would themselves be accused and be defendants, and the courts could also, they would mention that their brother would be one of the defendants or witnesses, and they would be mentioned in the newspapers. So through my history, I have found that deaf people back then, I've found how deaf people communicated back then through maybe sign language, or maybe it could be through ISL they've learned in Cabra, or writing, or the old Protestant school Claremont. They had a different sign there with this kind of finger spelling. So I've done a lot of research and found many different sources that mentioned communication methods that they used. And also home sign. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Like deaf people that would never have gone to deaf schools. They never learned sign language. But growing up in their family, and they would try and just communicate with themselves. It wouldn't be a fluent language, but they would be able to sign. So this is what I've mentioned already. So the 1800s, the court system would have different levels. Same now, the lowest would be the district court. That would be petty crimes, drinking, abuse, and then the second highest would be the circuit court, and then the highest would be the high court, and then the highest would be the supreme court. So, but back then it was a little bit similar. So this would be the lowest, the petty sessions. So they would just be minor cases. Oh, this works perfect. And then this is the second highest. The next level up will be, this would be similar to the circuit court today. It would be quite serious, like bad assaults or serious robbery and theft. And the highest court for the most serious crimes is assizes. And this is the high court now, but back then it had a different title. So this would be like murder or valuable property being stolen. So this is quite an unclear, fuzzy picture, but it's the petty sessions court. So this is what it looked like back then. So an Irish artist drew this. And I wasn't technically a judge, but it would be a magistrator, and they'd have 2 or 3 of them, So this is the man that was injured and is explaining his case. And that's him there. And then that would be the that would be the accused. And these people are delighted to come and watch the circuit court, the petty sessions court, and watch the arguments. You know, back then there was no TV, and reading wouldn't be a major hobby or pastime. So they came in here and had a great time watching. It was always very full. You know, even similar now, most of the court cases are actually public, and you can go in yourself and have a look. And you know, back then a lot of people couldn't read. You know, be quite illiterate. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. You know, there wasn't pictures back then, but there was you know, that must have been drawn, was it? So yeah, this is before that. So the petty sessions court never needed a jury. You know, they would just discuss it between themselves, and they would then decide. But the next level up would need a jury. And then the assize court, this is what that looked like. You know, they would have their black coats and their white wigs, and look very formal. And that's the judge. This is, you know, quite a high level of courts. That was the police back then. So, you know, Garda today. But at that time, it was the RIC, the Royal Irish Constabulary. So this is the police outside Dublin. But within Dublin, they had their own police. The DEP, the DNP, the Dublin Metropolitan Police. And it was really the same job, but it was it was separate to the rest of Ireland. So as you know, Tullamore Prison, yeah, you know it well. Maybe some of you aren't so sure of it. So this is a photograph of it. So it's not a jail anymore yet, but back then it was a jail. That's right. Prison. After 1922 it was changed, but before 1922 there was a huge amount of small Irish prisons all around Ireland, all around the country. And after 1922 it closed down. Many started closing down, and now there's only about 8 or 9. But back then there was 20 or 30 around the country. So yeah, even Tullamore had a prison. So what's Tullamore Prison now? I think it's a county council building, is it? That's right, yeah. So now I'll talk about Maryborough Prison. Portlaoise, that's right, yeah, Portlaoise is the old name. But this is Portlaoise Prison, but which is now gone. And this is an old photograph of it, and it still looks the same today. Anyone here from Longford? Yeah, we got one man over here. So Longford back then had a prison. And it wasn't just one large building, it was a few different buildings all linked together. And but the one at the front today is still there today. That's right, yeah, it's a school for disabled children.
may have seen on one of the previous slides, you saw the old name Maryborough. But we also have to remember that at that time there was a lot of different place names for different areas. And then after 1922 those place names started to change and go back to more traditional Irish names. So County Laois. Before the old names, anybody know what the old name was? No. Before the old name, before it was changed to County Laois. Queensland, I think. Queensland is one suggestion. Sort of.
No,
that's on it. No, that's on it. For the whole county of Laois. So the overall name was linked to Queen or King. So it was Queen's County. And then the next example I have here. So County Offaly. No name. Was it? Was it to do with the King? Yeah. King's County. Yeah. No difference of the King named for that. So obviously we already know that Port Laois previously was known as Maryborough. Yeah. And Burr. That's it. Yeah. That was the old name. What about Tullamore?
Oh,
Tullamore, Wayne, one suggestion there, the audience. But really, you'll all be shocked at the answer, which is Tullamore. It has never been changed. It's always been the same. It's always been called that. So when I was collecting information from newspapers and old newspapers, and there was various stories about deaf people being brought into court, maybe as witnesses or defendants. So I was collecting loads of information, I think maybe 1,000 different stories and different accounts of this happening. So then I started to look at stories, particularly stories that took place in the Midlands, like Laois and Offaly, Longford, Westmeath, and I focused on those 4 areas. So really overall, from those 4 areas, there have been 31 cases. So 28 of those cases were criminal cases, and the other 3 were just civil cases, like somebody suing another party or civil cases. So really they weren't that interesting, so I focused on the 28 criminal cases. So out of those 28 cases, the number of cases where the accused was deaf was 22. And then 5 of the cases involved a deaf person as a witness who came into court to make a statement or talk about their experience. And then there was one case that I found in the newspaper, but it wasn't really clear whether the deaf person or deaf individual was a defendant or a witness. I couldn't make it out. And I just thought it was also interesting to see that in those 28 cases, do you think they had an interpreter? I mean, what would happen if the deaf person was in court without an interpreter and couldn't understand what was going on or any of the proceedings? So really, out of the 28 cases that I looked at, 9 of those had an interpreter brought into the court. But I think so out of 28 minus 9 is 19. Okay, thank you. Because of the help there, I'm really bad at math. So 19 cases that I found from those newspapers never mentioned whether there was an interpreter present or somebody was brought in to help communicate with the deaf individual. So we really don't know what happened in those cases. But we know for sure that 9 cases had an interpreter. So who do you think were the interpreters? There was like this question on what interpreter means, you know, maybe, I don't know, it might be very high level, but really, back at that time, there was no official training for interpreters. Really, sign language wasn't seen as an official language at all. So really, if a deaf person was in court, they would look for someone who could sign. Can you sign? And if they said yes, then they were brought into the court to interpret. For example, maybe a member of the family, maybe like the deaf individual's brother, who could sign, or maybe they could understand them, they'd be brought in to interpret. So that happened 2 times. So the chairman of petty sessions really means the judge. And maybe he was in the court and he said, oh, hang on, I know how to use the alphabet in sign language, so that's how he communicated with the deaf individual. Just finger spelled everything. Or one time, there was a prison governor brought in who said that he could sign. But really, would you trust him to be the interpreter and be neutral? And then one time there was a workhouse master. So I don't know if you know, a long time ago, if there was somebody was poor, they had no job, they couldn't work, they'd go into a poorhouse, at the workhouse. So one time there was a deaf individual that was sent to court who came from a workhouse. And the workhouse master, that particular one, was asked would he be willing to interpret, and he did. And then another time there was a deaf person's boss that was called in to interpret. And then there were 3 other cases where it was just, a name was just given, so we don't know how they were related to the deaf person or what their role was in their lives. So out of those 22 deaf people that were accused and brought to court, I'm going to have a look at what offences were they accused of. So I'm going to talk about 4 from the Midlands. Or the 4 areas in the Midlands. So 8 times there was a deaf individual accused of assault, of larceny, of theft. 6 times there was a deaf person accused of this. And then there were 2 deaf individuals accused and brought into court for being drunken. And then also for disorderly conduct, there were another 2 accused for that. And then more serious than just disorderly conduct, there was riotous behaviour. So these are just some other offences that I wanted to look at. So I just found that there was only one instance of these that I found in London. So begging, malicious damage, one case of someone deserting their wife, just running off, the wife caught him and called him back. And one time there's someone who discharged a loaded rifle, so he was sent to court. So this next one is like he had an intent to steal, but he was caught on the premises, so he was brought to court for that. So being on the premises unlawfully. And then one last one is infanticide. Do you know what that is? So it means killing your own child. So, and I'll talk about that later in more detail. So all this information I got from, most of the information I did get from Dublin, collected in Dublin. So every prison would have a book, or like, to record information, or register. So every time a person was sent to prison, when they arrived, they were questioned about their name, their address, their age, their weight was noted down, and various different details. If they had any marks on their bodies. Like, you know, at that time there was a lot of disease, like smallpox, so they were asked if they had scars from smallpox or various different things like that. And then they would also include if they were deaf, if they were blind, lame, anything like that. So I have one example of this here from Tullamore prison. So you see his name here, John Manning. You can see his age is 25 and a half. He's 5'9". His hair was fair. His eyes were grey. And his skin looked fresh, as I described it here. But he was written down as being deaf and dumb. But you have to think at that time, that term deaf and dumb was used a lot. Of course it was terrible, but at that time that was the term used mostly in society. And then his weight is written down there, which is interesting to think. But at that time, a lot of people were very poor. They didn't have regular access to food or nice meals. But when you went to prison then, you were given food regularly. So when you're in prison, when you first arrived you'd be weighed, and then later you'd get weighed again at a later stage, and you'd find a lot of prisoners have gained weight because they had regular access to food. So maybe some people might make sure they get caught robbing just so they could go into prison to get regular access to food.
The same with homeless people.
People still in the audience are saying it's the same for the homeless situation in London too. So you can see there from born in Bangor, and he was arrested for larceny or theft. So he stole 3 shillings and 6 pence. And he was given 14 days in prison. So that's just one example. So if it was 14 days, very short, 2 weeks, and then you're sent off on your way. So the next example I have here is John Coleman. And he was born around 1831. I'm not sure exactly where John Coleman was from, but we think it was Tipperary in Capel-White. He could read and write, and we think that maybe he was educated in Claremont, the Protestant deaf school. Now, of course, it's closed down, but we feel like he could be educated there. And then in 1854, he was arrested and accused of stealing a silver watch. He was sent to court. And of course, in the courts then again, they had their own book or register. So every time someone was brought into court, they'd also write down the proceedings and what happened and record it. So this is from John Coleman's case. So you can see who's the defendant and the accuser. So you can see it's not really that clear, but you can see the names here. And written down as a dumb man. So at that time, if you were labelled as a dumb man, it would mean that you couldn't hear. So deaf and dumb. So this explains what he did, what time, what date it occurred on, and then the particulars were what happened. And talk about the magistrates and what they decided on the day in court, or maybe they decided that it was actually a more serious crime and I had to move up to the next level of court. So out of the 4 areas, the 4 counties that I looked at in the Midlands, John Coleman's case was the first case I saw that mentioned an interpreter. Before that I hadn't seen them mentioned before, but this case did. But who interpreted for him? So you can see again he was labelled here as a dumb man. So the interpreter worked for the prison. So, and that man's name was Mr. Young, and he worked for the prison. So he worked for the prison that the deaf man had been in. So maybe they had been trying to communicate at the time, and maybe he'd learned how to use the manual alphabet and tried to find a way to communicate. So then when John Coleman was brought to court and they were looking for someone who could communicate with him, he maybe volunteered. So when it came to the verdict from the proceedings in court, John Coleman was found to be guilty and sentenced to 3 months in prison. But also you have to consider the fact that the interpreter might not have liked him and maybe wanted him to be found guilty. So that could have influenced the interpretation. So maybe John Coleman was trying to make his case, but Mr. Young acting as the interpreter obviously was not able, and so maybe the interpretation wasn't clear enough, and maybe that influenced the verdict of guilty. So he went to prison, sent to prison for 3 months. And again, you can see he's labelled as a dumb man in the records. And then again, more information on himself, why he was arrested, and his sentence there at 3 months.
So this isn't such an interesting case, so I'll just skip him. Now this one. So this is a deaf man. This is the deaf man that tried to desert his wife, and he was eventually caught and brought to court. This is in 1861, and this is in Birr. And he had a wife and children, and he decided to leave, and he was eventually caught and brought to court. So now what happened? So Dennis, the deaf man, he was brought to court, and the judge tried to communicate with him. But the deaf man, of course, he didn't have an interpreter. And then he tried to explain his case by trying to understand that, the judge took his sign as his job, and he took it as he got his stuff in a rag.
He tried to explain that his job, or what he did for him, was a rag collector. And he tried to put this across to the judge to have him understand the situation.
So he was trying to explain that he didn't actually leave, he was just travelling the country, and he was just trying to work and sell his rags. And he explained that he did plan to come back, but he was eventually caught before he actually left. So the judge actually said, okay. And she tried to explain that he would never try to leave. He has a wife. And he tried to gesture that he loved his wife. And the judge saw this happening and he accepted it. And his wife was pregnant at the time with his 10th child. Pregnant with his 10th child. So then the judge decided to let him go and discharge
Sorry,
Dennis.
guys, I'm waiting for wait here. Sorry, I keep forgetting.
And this John Foley man, he was a bad man, and he was from Tullamore here. So he was born in 1842, and he didn't have any education. He couldn't read or write, and he was a butcher. Sorry, that's my sign. Butchers. Thank you. That's the sign for butcher here. And 20 times he was charged and given verdicts. Went to prison over 20 times. So this is quite an interesting case. And as he was completely illiterate and he had no education whatsoever. So he was eventually brought to court. And so as you know, the judge, in court you have to swear on an oath. You have to swear by God, and you have to tell the truth. So the judge was explaining, he was trying to explain that if you lie, you have to go to hell. Okay, maybe you don't have to go to hell, but just don't lie. But at that time, the judge tried to get if the deaf man understood that if you lied, you go to hell. If you didn't, you went to heaven. He was trying to get if the deaf man could understand the oath. So he asked the jury, "Do you think the deaf man understands the oath?" So the jury considered, and they decided yes, the deaf man can understand an oath. The deaf man tried to put it across that he had no idea why he was here. So then eventually it was decided that the deaf man was guilty. But then the jury actually recommended mercy, so didn't sentence him to death, but just to prison. So he was jailed for 6 months. Not too bad of a sentence. But before this he was in prison a lot, and eventually he came, and for the last time, and they just gave him still only 6 months. So what was John Foley actually in prison for? He was in prison for assault and being drunk and disorderly, petty crimes, you know, fighting and being drunk and disorderly, but because it happens so often. So again, another Tullamore case. Again, bad men in Tullamore. So as you can see here, he was down as deaf mute on the record. And he was a labourman. And RC here means Catholic. And R and W means he was literate, he could read and write. So it's quite a detailed. And he was only 5'2", small man. And that's his weight. He was born around the 1850s. And he went to Cabra and St. Joseph's. And then he came back to Tullamore after he finished school. So he was in prison for 10 times for drunkenness and assault. So Patrick was quite a troublesome character, but he himself suffered in this case, and he was actually assaulted. So the hearing person was actually brought to court. So Patrick was trying to give his statement as a witness, so he wrote out his statement and accused the man of assault. And the defendant tried to put it across that the deaf man took his pint of Guinness. So the judge decided to give him a fine, 10 shillings and 6 pence. Was the accused hearing or deaf? Oh, he was hearing himself. So this next man here, at his time, he was quite a known member of the parish, Joseph Walsh. Again, where do you think he's from?
What?
Tullamore again. Everyone jeering that Tullamore is a bad place. And he was born in 1850. So through my research, I've seen a lot of records in prisons. And I've seen a different man, Joseph Morris. And then they stay the same age and the same sort of, there's similar cases. So I saw here, he has an alias, which is like a nickname. You know, sometimes they would give a false name, and this is my name, Morris. Or he would give a fake name, Morris. But then in this case, they knew his name was Walsh, and he would swap his name quite often to try and, you know, hide from the system and get away from his other charges. So he went to St. Joseph's in Cabra. And he went to prison about 10 or 12 times, but over a long, long time of 35 years. You know, he started when he was about 1875 and stopped in 1911. So this is from the newspaper in a case from 1912. So just before 1912, Joseph Walsh actually died. So then the newspaper printed this. So they printed that, you know, the canal, yeah? So they had to, as you know, take a lot of trash out of the out of the canal and, you know, let the space have, you know, let boats go through, and they found a lot of material in the river, and they saw a butcher's knife. So an old man actually knew about that butcher's knife, and he told a story about a Joseph Walsh that threw a butcher's knife in the river. So this is what happened. So Joseph had a butcher's knife and actually stabbed a man. So this hearing man, his name is Boland. So that Boland saw and caught Joseph Walsh stealing from him. So they were on the run, and Joseph Walsh was running away. And then eventually he turned around and confronted the hearing man. And the police actually came, and they were having a tussle with Joseph Walsh, and the butcher's knife was in his hand. And the policeman eventually retrieved the knife and threw the knife in the canal. But before that, he actually had stabbed the hearing man in the arm. That's how the police came. So the man saw the danger and did try and pull the knife from Joseph Walsh and threw it in the river and arrested Joseph. So the knife, of course, went to the bottom of the canal and was there for years and years, 50 years later. And they eventually retrieved and saw the knife and remembered the story. And the newspaper actually gave quite a long description of Joseph Walsh's life. So they gave that his job was to give out newspapers throughout the town. And Joseph Walsh was quite a strong man, quite a broad man. But of course later in life he got sick and he got old. And he had to go into a workhouse, and a few weeks later he died. And the hearing man that Joseph Walsh actually stabbed, his arm was actually, he lost use of his arm. And yes, he did go to jail. You mentioned 50 years down in the canal? Yeah, that's right, yeah. The butcher's knife was down in the 50 years down in the water of the bottom of the canal, like a river. So, you know, when the policeman actually, within the tussle, finally got the knife and threw the knife in the water, the knife was left there for 50 years until they found it. So now all the stories about Tullamore are finished, so I'm very sorry. So now I'm going to move on to Longford. And Longford, this story is actually much worse. It's a terrible story. So this is man John Keane. In Clongford, which is actually quite near to the border. So again, he was never educated. He had no deaf brothers or sisters. You know, so he grew up in a hearing family, so it would have been very difficult. So this is the police record, and they would write a report after it all happened. So what happened was that John Keane was one day very frustrated and went to his mother and tried to ask for money from her, you know, for clothes. And the mother just refused to give him any sort of money, and eventually John Keane just completely snapped and just stabbed his own mother and killed his mother. And he stabbed her to injury and she was brought to the hospital, and she eventually died. So we haven't put Oh, was there an E at the end of his name because his mother had an E at the end of his name? Oh, back then after the 1900s, then it was really strict, but it was the spelling could vary quite a bit back then. So this is a court in Wicklow. So I thought this was quite an interesting case. So John was brought to court, and his brother, his hearing brother, was brought as a witness. So his brother's statement was that he never went to school. He wasn't educated. He didn't know it. He was completely illiterate. He doesn't even know his ABCs. So the judge asked him, "Do you know how to communicate with your brother?" And all he could ask was what he did in work. He never felt at home. He never communicated at home. So again, the 12 people in the jury, they discussed the case, and throughout the trial they spoke about the case, and they just couldn't proceed with John Keane having no clue about how the trial process was or having a clue what's going on. And even they brought an interpreter in, and John Keane still hadn't a clue, so they had to declare him insane. He just wasn't able to say whether he himself was guilty or not guilty, so he was sent to a lunatic asylum. And that lunatic asylum was in Dundrum. Do you know the huge mental asylum in Dundrum? So now I'll give my signing a break, and I'll give the interpreters a break, and I'll just show a quick 5-minute clip. And after the video, will we take a general break yet? Maybe you've seen it before, but it's just a 5-minute clip. So there's the man here talking about history, and he looks quite like me, but there is one difference.
So hello everyone, welcome back. I'm going to check that this live stream is working. Okay, yeah, no, that's fine, yeah. Start it again. Okay, so before we took a break there, we watched the video about James Brennan, who was caught for theft. So maybe you think, oh, I'm not really interested, he's from Dublin, but no, actually James before lived in Tullamore. So in 1895, James didn't really have anywhere to live, so he kind of wandered around Ireland, and he ended up here in Tullamore. I think it was in Ballinagare. Near, I think it's between Tullamore and Danger. So it's near Tullamore. So when James arrived, he saw a church, and he decided to go in and have a look. He saw it was empty, there was none around. And before, when you go into the church, you see at the back there was a gold case, and of course James went straight for it. It was like a small tin box. And Sonny thought it was beautiful, so he grabbed it, put it under his arm, and walked out of the church. And then a little while later, a priest walked in and saw that it was missing. But then when the case came to court, someone said, yeah, I definitely saw James walking off with the gold tin box. So he's brought to court to decide whether he was guilty or not. So just before the trial, James was arrested in Tullamore. You can see the record here. He was labelled as deaf mute. So before, the language used for it all was a little bit different. So of course he went into church and wrote a box, but the language used in the reports was a little bit different at that time. So this is the court that James was brought to. And it was called the quarter sessions. So that was kind of the middle court. It wasn't the highest court. It was the next up down. So of course a lot of people were interested to go in and see the trial, to see what happened, because they were starting to see that the accused was deaf, and how would they carry on with the trial, how would they communicate with him. So a lot of people went in to watch and see what happened. They went in, they were curious as how they would communicate with James Brennan. But James Brennan used paper, so he was given a stack of paper and a quill and some ink. It was handed to him. And then, so there was no sign language used or anything, it was all written, everything was written down. But in the newspaper report it said that Tullamore had an interpreter. Didn't mention a name of this interpreter, but then the court decided that they didn't need it, they just write everything down. But James was well able, he was literate. I think you saw before, I mentioned in the video that he had a very good level of English. So he wrote down everything that he wanted to say and then passed it over. The judge would read what he said and would read it aloud for the court. And in his statement he said that it was about 12 o'clock at night. I came from the canal, that it was raining really heavy, so he went into the reformatory shed. Before it was just a shed that we used beside the school, and he went in there to sleep. And he said that's all that I did that night. But really, as the trial progressed, it really looked like there was no firm evidence that he committed the crime. They had no way to prove out whether it was him or another person that had stolen the box. So the judge decided that they couldn't find him guilty. But the judge also said, he wrote a message to him that said, if you come back into court again, if you're brought back to court, brought in front of a jury and brought in front of me, I will give you 7 years sentence in prison. And then he handed that note over to James. So James obviously was a bit confused with what was going on until he was handed the note. So he started to read the note, which was quite long. But he didn't really read it fully, he just saw 7-year sentence and he started panicking, he started begging and pleading with the judge, he started crying, and he was very upset by the whole thing. The judge didn't understand why he was crying, so he told the policeman beside, the police officer, to tell him to make sure he read the full note. So they told him to make sure that he reads everything in the note before he starts panicking. And then James realised, he thought he'd been sentenced to 7 years, but he hadn't. He was told that if he was brought before the court again and before that judge, he'd be given 7 years. So he was so grateful, he bowed to the judge and everything, and then he left the court as soon as he could. So before when James was arrested, they took all his belongings off him. He had a gold ring and he had lots of different valuables. So they were of course taken off him, and then after the trial happened, of course he was able to take them back, but he said he didn't want any of his belongings back. He just got out of there as quickly as he could and left Tullamore. So James Brennan was acquitted. What a relief. Oh yeah, that's right, sorry. Got to mention that in the video. You might have seen 2 photographs of James. You can see both standing in the same position with his hands up like that. You might be asking why he was posed like that, but at that time there were a lot of criminals had tattoos on their hands. So people decided that if someone were to be arrested, they'd take a picture. You know, before the old-fashioned cameras, they had, but they wanted to be able to see the hands in the picture, which meant that if they were to escape and if they had to look, they could use, maybe they had love tattooed on their fingers, they could tell the public this, to watch out for a man with love tattooed on his hands. So maybe they could hide their face or wear a hat or something, but you might be able to catch them from the tattoos on their hands. Sorry, my coffee's still a bit too hot. So this next example of Maria Rourke. So Maria Rourke was a hearing woman. She was a deaf victim. She was attacked by a hearing person, and really, she suffered a lot. She was born around 1818, and she lived in Tullamore. So Maria had no education. She was illiterate. And then in 1835, Maria accused 2 RAC policemen of raping her. So the case was brought to court, and of course Maria was brought in as a witness. And she was willing to tell her story and give her statement about what happened. But the court again were a little bit concerned that the fact that she was deaf and that she was illiterate, and they weren't really sure she'd be able to understand the oath and what would happen if she lied, and how serious that she had to take the oath. So maybe, do you know this? Do you know where this is? Yeah, this is Portlaoise Courthouse. So this is where the trial was held. So this photograph was taken in the 1930s, but of course the actual events that we're talking about now happened around 1835. So you can see this car parks there now. Trying to put your money into the meter to pay for your car parking. Just I was really surprised at how car parks at that time. So of course I don't remember what happened, so maybe somebody else remembers. I don't know. Not bad. So remember, the old name for this was Mary Borough, as Portlaoise, and this is the highest level court. So this is very difficult to read. But basically, Maria's mother, when they realised that Maria was deaf, they called her mother into the court as a second witness. And they questioned her mother about Maria and about what had happened. So she explained that Maria had gotten malaria when she was 1.5, and that was how she became deaf. So of course she grew up and she used sign language to communicate. And we were saying that she could understand her fine, she could communicate really well with her, could understand her no problem. So the court asked, could Maria's mother translate the questions, and if you ask me the question, I can sign it to her and then I can tell you what she says, what her answer is. She was willing to do that. And the judge also asked if Maria could understand the oath and about God, did she understand about religion? And she said that before she brought a priest to see her. So that Maria did understand about religion, she understood about God. So her mother was very definite about that, she could understand, so the judge agreed, and they decided to start the trial. And the mother would act as her interpreter. So of course, before they started, they had to make sure that Maria understood the difference between right and wrong, good and bad. So they asked her mother to ask her, does she know the difference between right and wrong? But the mother said, yeah. So she kind of signed and communicated with her. And Maria said, pointed down, and she indicated with gesture that she knew the difference between heaven and hell, good and bad. So the judge saw this, and then handed a Bible over. And Maria took the Bible, and she kissed the Bible, blessed herself, and handed the Bible back. So the judge thought, great, that's fine, she understands religion, she understands the oath, so they could begin the trial. So in the end, this is the verdict. So really what happened, it looked like there was a lot of witnesses that saw something happen. They knew that something had gone on. They saw that how upset Marie was after. They brought a doctor in. And the doctor also said that he'd examined her and said definitely there was evidence of rape. But then another man came in and said, nope, I saw her go willingly with the two men. So the judge was a bit suspicious. And then the two police officers that were accused were brought into the court, and the judge decided, you know what you might see in the TV where they get a suspect and then they get some other people into a lineup, and that means they get the victim to try and pick who they think has committed the crime against them out of the lineup. So they did that with the two police officers. They got some other men in and did a lineup, and they gave Marie a stick to point at the man that she thought did it. She looked and she looked a bit confused. But the judge saw her mother pointing at the two men, and then as soon as her mother indicated to Maria, she used the stick to point at the two officers. But when the mother was confronted about this, she denied it. That of course made the jury a little bit suspicious. It felt like there was something going on, and really think that that's why the two officers were found not guilty and were let off. But really well done to Maria. She was so brave to come in and tell her story and try and prosecute.
So we have another video here, and this video is linked to the Midlands from Athlone. So I'll start talking about this woman. So I do want to thank the two interpreters to give up their Friday night that they could have been drinking and partying, but they would come here and interpret, so thank you. But this girl, this woman Joanna, she was born in Kerry, near Waterville, in 1870, and she went to St. Mary's in 1883. So when she finished school, she got a job in Dublin, but there was problems happened and there was issues. So then she came to Athlone. So she got another job in Athlone, I think as a servant of some sort. But she finished with that job, and she was quite poor, so she had to go to the workhouse. So do you know, the workhouse is a really terrible place to work. It's a very poor place to work, you know. No one would want to go into a workhouse just because there's free food. It was, very known as a terrible place, but Joanna really didn't have a choice. But then something terrible happened. So we do have a video, but first of all, do you know where Athlone Workhouse is? Do you know where it is? No? Do you know this building? Is that opposite the Deaf Club? Is that the opposite the Deaf Club? Yeah, it's in front. So that's the front building, and the workhouse is directly behind it. And the workhouse was destroyed eventually, but the front building is still there now. So this is the video. This is quite a sad story. So Joanna, before the trial, she was arrested in Tullamore prison. She was only 25 years old. And you can see her deaf mute, and she's from Kerry. and she last lived in Athlone. So this is the court in Athlone. One interesting point here. The interpreter during the trial, the manager of the workhouse, he volunteered to interpret. At the beginning of the trial, as the proceedings went on. After a while, the other side of the solicitors decided that they didn't like the interpreter and wanted to change the proceedings to written statements by each, the defendant and the accused. So and Joanna was well able to write her statements. And yes, she was acquitted. So after the court, after she was acquitted, at the time of the video, the hands-on video, I really didn't know what actually happened to Joanna after the workhouse. I did a lot of research and found with no luck and no joy. So I didn't know whether she actually just died, or I had no idea. So as you know, the court decided to give the responsibility to the workhouse for her. So I really didn't know what happened to her in the workhouse. So then I thought, what if she was married? At that time in the 1800s, early 1900s, if deaf would rarely marry. In Ireland, it would be quite unusual. In Northern Ireland, the Protestants, the deaf people often married, but here in Catholic Ireland, hearing people and deaf people both have a very low rate of marriage, and deaf people especially, it was a very, very low rate. So I assumed she wasn't married, but then after the video I decided, why not have a look, and then I found her. So she was married to James Clark, a deaf man, and he was a bootmaker. So in 1899, he was married. Before that, Joanna moved to Dublin to work in the Mater Hospital. And at that time, there's a lot of deaf women working in the Mater hospitals, working as cooks or cleaners in the Mater Hospital. This was, do you know the old IDS building? Yeah, it's right. It's near enough to DeafHear on North Frederick Street, opposite Mountjoy. So it looks like she was involved with the deaf community and, signed away and eventually met James and fell in love and married James Clark. So here you can have, I think these are the witnesses. And we found out that these are both deaf as well, so they must have had a good presence in the deaf community. And was there an interpreter during the wedding? I'm not sure. So the census of Ireland in 1901, they would take a census of the population of Ireland, and in Dublin she lived with her husband and with a child, with her daughter Agnes, and she's only 5 years old. But it was very sad to find out that Joanna, she had a long life, and overall with 8 children, but a lot of them died very young, and then her husband eventually died as well, and then Joanna eventually died much later, in 1950s. In 1954, she eventually died, and she was 86. So you're right, yeah, she died on Christmas Eve. I never noticed that. Thanks, Damien. She died on Christmas Eve. How did you know she died on Christmas Eve? Well, you can see the date here, 24th of December. Oh, you have a keen eye. I had no idea. And one of her daughters was there when she died. And that's her name. I'm not too sure her first name, but her second name is Fahy. So it looks like that's right, yeah, she must have been married. But I don't know, I haven't researched if she had any children and her grandchildren. I would love to see if they're still alive now and tell them that do you know this information about your grandmother? So I will try, but at the moment I'm very, very busy, but you know, I will look into this. But I was so happy to find this information, and I wanted to have a see if I could find where she was buried, and see maybe she's buried in Glasnevin, and I found where she was buried. So she doesn't have a headstone, but in the beginning maybe it was wood that eventually disappeared, or the stone might have eventually crumbled. So the family must have visited, you know, less and less as time went on, and eventually just became a flat piece of ground. So there's stone all the way through, and then just a gap of her body. And there's just one sheet of paper that I put down to mark the... So when I arrived, you know, I wanted to try and mark the stone with something maybe related to death, so I took out my bag and saw one piece of paper relating to IDS and the contact information with interpreter numbers on it, so I put that there to see just a bit of information. So how did you know that was actually her gravestone? So there's Glasnevin office, and I went in to try and find, and I asked them to see if they had Joanna. So I got the number of Glasnevin, and then they eventually gave me the gravestone, the grave number, so you can find it just by number. It's all done in a grid pattern. So the Christian brothers and plenty of nuns were actually buried there as well. So you said Joanna had 8 children. Are you going to try and find out how they died, or if they or why they died so young? So yes, I have actually found out a few. I've found a few death certificates of the children. But they've gone through different, you know, I've tried to find out why. But I do have some information, but I actually can't remember right now, but all the information is in the computer. How did you know that was the particular gravestone? I looked up Joanna Clark on the internet. So I saw there was a link to it. She died in 1954, and there was a number there. Well, you didn't know you could find out that way. So there's the husband and wife.
Okay.
So she had hearing children, but I'm sure with two deaf parents they grew up with sign language. But that's what the census said. So maybe someone in the area, or in Dublin, or in the Holy Family Schools. You know, they might have some long lost family link, you know. Genes could be anywhere.
So now this is my last story. Really, this one doesn't have a link to the Midlands, but it's just a very interesting story. So this woman, Mary Donoghue, lived in the north of Ireland, in Belfast. Really, it's a very brief but interesting story. So we should finish in time for any questions if you have any. So Mary Donoghue was born in Lurgan around 1864. In Armagh. So Mary Donoghue did receive an education, but it wasn't here in Ireland. In fact, her family emigrated to America, to St. Louis in Missouri. Sorry, just do you have a sign there for? Okay. That's a sign for St. Louis. So the children, when she was growing up, realised she was deaf, and they found a deaf school near enough where they lived, and so she was sent to school to get an education. And that school, deaf school, is actually still there. It's the Missouri School for the Deaf. So I actually contacted the school to ask them if they had any information about Mary. But really, after 1880, well, as far as you can tell, the family stayed in America, but Mary went back to Ireland. I'm not really sure as to why. Maybe there was a disagreement with her father. Her father was very high up in the police service in America. So I think maybe, was he embarrassed to have a deaf daughter? So is that why he sent her to Ireland? Really, we don't know why exactly. So Mary came back to Ireland and lived in Belfast. She married a deaf man, David Wilson. And as you know, at that time, Belfast had a big business building ships, and he worked as a driller. And she had a job in a factory. But it wasn't a happy marriage. And just to go back, just to tell you that Mary herself worked in a clothes factory. Her job title was a smoother. I think it's linked to the clothes, maybe like ironing the clothes or something. I'm not really too sure what that job actually entailed. So in 1895, Mary and her husband David separated. Her husband moved to a new house, and he moved in with a deaf widow. There's a mix of Catholic and Protestant deaf people, so he moved and he left Mary, and she was all left on her own. She had no home, no stable home. She moved around a lot around that time. So from that point on, Mary was arrested again and again, and she was brought to court several times. So mostly it was for larceny or theft. And then also 1 or 2 times she was arrested for drunkenness. It's interesting to see that when I was researching everything that happened, the one common connection I saw, that Mary often stole from other deaf people. So she'd meet them, have a conversation with them, and then steal from them. And the deaf people would come back and realise that their belongings were gone, and that happened a lot. So she was brought to court several times by other members of the deaf community accusing her of stealing. And she was always very apologetic, but it really looked bad. Because, you know, maybe it was a hearing person stealing from them. The deaf community was to have a very strong relationship. But the fact that it was a deaf person stealing from them was also very hard. She was kind of isolated from the community because of that. So on 2 separate occasions, Mary was brought to court and she was sent to the Ennis Inebriate Reformatory. Which really means it's a reformatory for alcoholics. It's not really like a traditional prison with bars and the windows. It was more, they tried to give them advice and tried to help them to stop their drinking. And then she was sent away, and then 1 year later she was arrested again in Belfast and was sent back to the Ennis for 3 years. It really looked like she liked her time there and she enjoyed being there. And then after the 3 years were up, she went back to Belfast and she got into trouble again. And Mary pleaded with the judge to be sent back to Ennis. So Mary was pregnant while in prison in the 1900s, and she gave birth to the child while in prison. And his son's name was David. I know that she didn't keep the child was taken from her. Really, I think that was the prison's decision to take the child from her and to put the child up for adoption for another family, and that was in 1900. then I saw in the 1901 census there was no child called David Wilson. And then again the 1911 census I looked again for another child that was 10 years old, but I couldn't find him. So I think that maybe the child was given up for adoption and therefore his surname was changed. His name was changed. But Mary really missed her son when he was taken from her. So one reason why Mary's story is so interesting is that there's a lot of evidence and letters that she had written while she was in prison to ask for her sentence to be reduced and to ask for her to be let out of prison. So it was very emotional. I was reading all of these letters. So the Ennis Reformatory, they really like to keep track of the individuals they had there and their progress. So they kept a lot of records of the people that came in and came through the reformatory. So you can see they have a description. Just a female aged 34, number 19, mentioned that she was deaf mute and that she was separated from her husband because she had relationships with other men. So she was sent back to America to her father. Her father said that he couldn't cope with her, he couldn't control with her, so she was sent once again back to Ireland. And again, she had no stable home in Ireland. She was still stealing and getting into trouble with the police. So after Mary left the reformatory, they recommended that somebody keep an eye on her after she left Ennis and went back to Belfast. But they had a plan for her. They didn't want her just wandering aimlessly around. They had a plan for her. And that was that she go to a convent in Belfast. So they had made the plan for her to go to the convent. They didn't really tell her this, they had the plan for her. They didn't tell her, so then she arrived back to Belfast and she was brought there, and then she realised it was a convent and she was so upset. She did not want to be living in the convent. She was refusing and trying to get away. She just really, really did not want to go into the convent. So this is one example of a time when Mary was arrested and she wrote a statement to apologise and to explain why she did what she did. So it's about the same. I've just retyped it there because it's super hard to read. So you can just have a read it there. So you can see there, Nazareth House. That's like a special institution that if a mother was left with a child with no father, she could go there to get some help and support. Is it like an orphanage? And it's not really like an orphanage, it's really for the mother and the child to go to stay in the house to get some support. So she just didn't want to stay in prison, she wanted to go somewhere like that to get help and be with her child. So again, then in 1903, she was arrested again for theft. And again, she made a written statement. So you can see it's interesting here, Francis McGinn. I don't know if any of you know who that is. He's a very interesting man. He was an Irishman, deaf man, and he went to school to get education. He was very intelligent. He also went to America, to Gallaudet University. And then when he finished studying there, he came back to Ireland and actually moved to Belfast. There he worked there with the church. He was a chaplain for the Church of Ireland in Belfast, and like to help deaf people. And really, he's a very influential man. And he also worked with the British Deaf Association. He was one of the first people to help set that up. And at that time, in 1890, 1903, between that time period, Francis McGinn was also very good at helping if someone didn't have a job. He'd write a letter on behalf of the person to talk about their skills and to give them a good reference for the job. And he tried to help a lot of people. So Mary contacted him and asked him for help. And he was more than willing. But again, tried to help, but again, she was stealing from deaf people again, and it was very frustrating. She was constantly getting into trouble and getting sent back to prison. So then Francis McGinn kind of distanced himself from her. He'd had enough and he wasn't getting anywhere. But Mary kept saying she really wanted to live with him, but he refused. Really, he thought, I have lots of support here, but there's no one here to help her. There was no one helping her at all. And then in 1907, again she was caught for theft and arrested. She stole 2 brushes and a shawl. And at that time, theft was a serious crime. It was treated very seriously in the legal system. So the 1820s and 30s, if you were stolen, you could be hung. If you were caught for that, it was a very serious crime at that time. And again, she wrote letters of apology and pleaded again with the judge. So it looked like that on the inside she still loved her husband deep down, and she just was asking for some support. I mean, it wasn't like that she was a single woman and she was independent. She really felt that she needed her husband to look after. Of course, there's a lot of people talking about before that about the baby, and her husband had left her, and she was put down a lot by other people in the community. And again, her situation got worse and worse, and then in 1914, again she was brought back to court. So they decided to give her a more serious punishment, as she was a repeat offender. So she was accused of stealing a handbag that had a purse in it, and the judge decided to sentence her to 3 years. I'm going to use PS, it's penal servitude, which means that she wouldn't be staying in the local prison in Belfast. She'd be moved to prison in Dublin and stay there for maybe 9 or 10 months, and then she'd be moved to Cork prison. I mean, it was really one of the more serious sentences. So again, Mary wrote several letters and she posted them to the government, begging and pleading with them to have her sentence reduced and to let her out of prison. And as time went on, as she was moved from prison to prison, her health really deteriorated. So Mary wrote a letter, another letter, in 1916. So it's a very sad story, but at the same time, Ms. here says me in jail for nothing. She says she was in jail for nothing, but she was caught several times stealing. Then to just say that she did nothing, I mean, come on, it's... I mean, of course it's a very severe punishment, but I mean, come on, she wasn't innocent. So these pictures over here. So this is after she'd been sent to Dublin, Mountjoy. It was very funny. I said, do you know the Dublin National Archives? I went in there, they're full of old paperwork and reports and records. So you can just go in, you can order to see files, and you can have a look at them, like prison records. Like, so I asked to see her files, and then I found so many photographs of her, and they were taken at 2 or 3 month intervals, so you can really see how she started to change over the time in prison. So you can see the change that occurred there, and how old she began to look after all the suffering and everything that she'd been through. So altogether, she had been in and out of prison for a total of nearly 9 years. Stuck behind bars in cold and terrible conditions. And also without her son, as he'd been taken away. Yeah, it was a very hard life. But I feel like if she'd been here, she might have had more chance. Maybe she could have moved to Canada or different parts of America, but being deaf, maybe she found it difficult to find support. Maybe she was just fixed the same way as her husband did. She was just pushed aside. So ever since she left prison, and then she was sent back to prison again in Mountjoy in 1918. So she left Mountjoy on the 8th of June, but then after that, there's no trace of her. I tried to find out if she died and to try a firm date of death. I looked online to try and find her death certificate. When I tried to search Mary Wilson, I found so many records, and I just couldn't determine which one exactly was her. I'm sure after that, she hadn't been into prison again. So I'm sure she died soon after she was released from prison that time. From all the records, I found one that I thought maybe could be her, matched her profile, from 1921. So I think maybe that when she left Mountjoy, she went back to Belfast, and that's where she died, possibly, but I'm not too sure. So that's the end. Thank you all. Do you have any questions?